Hi, I'm Annalisa.
I'm Nicole.
And I'm Maggie.
And this is Unconditional, the podcast.
So we're kicking off this podcast, Unconditional. So we're going to talk a little bit today about what that means. So, Lisa, in the book which you wrote, why is it unconditional? What about that word stood out?
Originally, the title of my book was Love Yourself Like Your Dog Loves You, Unconditionally. And that is still a title of one of the chapters because I could not let it go. But my editor, who has many decades more experience with publishing books than I do, made it clear that that's more of a bumper sticker than the title of a book. So then I kept digging and I came up with the title, The Self-Love Habit, 21 days to something. But that book was taken, or that book title was taken by another brilliant therapist who likes to write. So I kept digging and I found what I think is the best title, Unconditional, Learning to Love Your Authentic Self. Because by the end of the book, that is in fact the promise that I'm making to my readers, right? That by practicing these and many other techniques, which are, as we're going to talk about today, really acts of self-care, you can continue to cultivate and deepen your love for yourself. Where we want you to get is being able to love yourself without any conditions, right? You don't have to do anything more, be anything more, spend more money, be any particular size, look a certain way. You can just be yourself and love that exactly the way it is.
And we kind of decided that in conjunction with the publishing of this book, that revamping our creation of what our bibliotherapy podcast was.
It feels like, when we were doing like the bibliotherapy podcast, yes, we were looking at other brilliant individuals writing on what their perspectives are on self-care, right? And, acts of gratitude and, practicing, loving yourself and, being positive and those kinds of things. And that's awesome. But we also have a person who has written a piece of work, right, that also talks about a lot of those things. And so we're able to pull from that piece and then make it more relatable and make it also like bigger, right? Like use that as the foundation of what we're going to talk about, which is why we're naming the podcast after the piece of art that Lisa has made.
I'm like shrinking further and further down in my chair because it's still so strange for me to think of myself as an author or as one of the, writers, one of the many published writers out there that has something worth saying. And of course I do have something worth saying. It's why I sat down and wrote the book. I made this comment on my personal social media page the other day. Publishing this book is going to be the ultimate act of unconditional self-love because it's so scary. Right? It's so hard to think about all these folks reading what I have to say and potentially, judging and certainly forming their own opinions, which is what you should do as a reader, right? You should read it and form your own opinion and decide which parts make sense for you and which don't. And that's all okay. And it's scary.
Yeah. I mean, I can think of like parts of the book where, I've read it multiple times.
Spoiler.
I've read it multiple times, and not to give too much away, but there are definitely chapters in the book where it I either I've never found that enjoyment, right? The first thing that comes to my mind is meditation. I mean, what is a self-care book without talking about meditation at least once? And it's something that I've tried so hard. And Lisa, you do so well, but I do not. But part of self-love, right, is I acknowledge that is not in my wheelhouse, and that is okay. There are other ways to be mindful without the meditation, but it's something that's, broadening the horizons. And so like, that's the purpose of your books and of other books of its kind, right? Of broadening the horizons, starting the conversation for yourself. So that, it's a kickstart to your journey.
So a few weeks ago, I was participating in an MBSR course, mindfulness-based stress reduction. So not a course, a group. I was participating as a client, right? Not as like a facilitator or student. So this is where a therapist who is trained in John Kabat-Zinn's evidence-based program on mindfulness and how it can reduce stress and anxiety in your life. So she facilitates this group for a small number of people who commit to meditating for 40 minutes every day, and then attending the 2.5-hour class once a week. And then halfway through the program, do a 6-hour silent retreat. And we're almost halfway through the program, and the therapist is asking for feedback. So how is it going for you? What do you like? What do you dislike? And I raise my hand, and I'm all like gung-ho and like have way too much energy for 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night. And I'm like, this has been such a treat. That was my exact phrase. This has been such a treat. I'm loving this class so much. And I love meditating every day, and it just feels really good. And here's the way it's changed, my sleep patterns, and it's made things more fun around the breakfast table with my family and whatever, gush, gush, gush. And then after I'm done, I hit mute because we're on Zoom, right? So I hit mute. I'm waiting for someone else to provide their feedback. And the teacher leans in and says, I just want everyone to know that is not the normal experience at this point in the program. And it's okay if you think it's a treat to meditate every day, but if you don't feel that way, it really is normal. I was just like, oh man.
I wish that our listeners could see the faces that Maggie and I both made when she said 6 hours.
Yeah.
6-hour meditation and retreat, which, hey, not knocking it, I think is great if that is something that you find great joy in.
It sounds phenomenal.
If I could do it, I mean, totally.
Right? To just sit in silence for 6 hours, let's do it. I mean, I'm all for it. But like, wow.
Okay, if there are any parents listening to the podcast right now, imagine 6 hours of silence.
And that is your cue to go take at least 5 of silence, because 6 hours is really going to set the bar high for you.
Okay, so if you're listening to this podcast or reading the book Unconditional, you do not have to start meditating every day for 40 minutes a day. You don't have to do anything, actually. You don't have to meditate at all if you don't want to.
Disclaimer, you don't have to do a thing. We'll do it all. So in today's episode, we're kind of delving into what is the difference between self-love and self-care. What are their realms, what goes into both of them. And before we started recording, I came across a perfectly perfect way to describe the two and kind of differentiating them, which this just came up on Google, good old Google, from Plenty Consulting. It's a blog post, and they say self-care is about fixing what is out of alignment in our lives. Self-love, however, is the deep knowing that at our core, there's nothing that needs fixing.
That really is a perfect way of explaining it. Like, it shows the layers, right, of self-love being, like, Lisa was saying, that unconditional part, right? The thing that no matter what, you are, you're being your authentic self. And the self-care is what is really adding to that, right? In different parts of life.
Yeah. So as counselors, what is that phrase actually saying? What, break that down for people. Explain to me like I'm 5, guys. What does that mean?
It's a good question. And when clients first come in, their first or second session, right, early on in our work together, one of the things that we talk about is their self-care practices. I don't necessarily always use the phrase self-care. Actually, the phrase that I use is, the question that I use is, how are you eating? How are you sleeping? And how are you moving? And so any of my clients that listen to this are gonna be like, yeah, I remember that conversation. And I drew a funky little stool on the whiteboard, and eating, sleeping, and moving were each of the legs. And then I drew a little yogi sitting, a little stick figure of a yogi sitting on top of it, and explained that in order for us to really do the kind of deep work we need to on your mental and emotional health, we have to make sure that you have a solid foundation. Right? We have to make sure that you're taking care of yourself in these basic ways. And I think of those basic things as self-care, right? Like drinking a glass of water in the morning and taking your vitamins, and, recognizing when you need to go for a walk or ask for help, right? These are all acts of self-care. And when you have that foundation, you're giving us a place to start from, so we can go a lot further and then start to explore the problems that are probably connected to self-worth, self-compassion, self-love, ultimately. So one is a set of tools, and the other is really how you're feeling about your authentic self.
So one thing to that topic that popped into my head when I'm talking with a lot of clients who are making maybe habit changes or just change in general, is that if necessary, the change works with your lifestyle, not forcing the change by making your lifestyle fit that habit. Right. So when thinking about self-love and like kind of thinking back to the book, right, of a lot of the things that come up, some of those techniques might not fit into somebody's everyday life. And so there can be that, I know I felt it, that like guilt or frustration of like, why can't I be a person who blank, right? Why can't I wake up at 5 a.m. and go on a nice stroll and come in and feel energized at that time of day?
Why can't I meditate for 40 minutes straight?
Exactly, right? And for some people, it just doesn't work out that way, and that's okay. So like part of that is like that guilt of possible feelings of like pressure coming from other spots, right? Oh, to be in good health, I should be doing this. To be a good, partner, I should be doing this. To be a good parent, I should be doing this, right? And so if it doesn't fit into the current lifestyle, yes, there's going to be a lot of pushback, and then add to that frustration or that guilt. And so giving grace of maybe it's something that you've tried and it didn't work. And that doesn't necessarily mean that something's like quote unquote wrong with you, or that you're not doing it quote unquote right. It just might not be for you. And that's okay. That's why we have so many different things to choose from. If it was as easy as do these 5 steps, like all the magazines say, we would be able to do it, and we wouldn't need those magazines or those, a self-love book or
Therapists.
Yeah, exactly. Like we would have it all down. My sessions would be 1 session long. Hey, you're having this issue. Here's these 5 things. Have a nice rest of life. Right? Like we wouldn't have any other sessions together. but like there is that feeling of like guilt or, you know, frustration or anxiety, even of like, why isn't this working? Why can't I make this change? It might just not fit.
That really highlights the fact of something that we've talked about so many times. It's kind of become a pillar in our practice, I think, is that self-care is ever changing. Self-care is definitely not one size fits all. Self-care is, it's case by case, dependent on the person. Everybody's journey looks different, which is why, you know, Unconditional isn't a strict 21-day guide. We, you know, try to um, really exaggerate that, because it's not going to take 21 days to could do a complete 180 and a complete turnaround, and uh, you know, start all these healthy habits that you've been wanting to do for so long. You know, sometimes it starts with one thing.
Yeah, my favorite part of the 21-day journey is it's not even the 21-day journey. I believe it's in the conclusion when I say, go back through your journal that you kept while you were reading this book, pick out the one thing that you really enjoyed, or maybe it was the one thing that was really hard for you, or however you want to do it. Just pick one of them out and spend the next 21 days just focusing on that thing. So if you really do want to learn to meditate for 40 minutes a day, go back to the chapter on meditation and just focus on that for the next 21 days. Just let that be the thing you explore, right? You really just want to practice self-care. Okay, cool. Go back to that chapter and just do that every day, right? Just have some fun with it. So it's like the book is like the poo-poo platter of self-love and self-care practices.
Yes, it's yeah, like I like that piece of this. It doesn't, there's a guarantee of getting on your journey to self-love, but it's not a guarantee that this is just your journey to self-love, right? Like it's not like these 21 days are going to get you to like the end all be all and be like, yes, I have found my way. Like, thank you very much. And
I have reached enlightenment.
I am the yogi on top of the stool sitting. So a lot of what I tried to do in this book was bring Benji's playful nature like into the story, into the writing. And I do that in therapy and I do that in my life as well. So I have a therapy dog who farts in session and makes people laugh. And in my life, I play as much as I practice gratitude, right? As much as I work. So I just want to point out that when I said poo-poo platter, everybody giggled and smothered their giggles. And I just want our listeners to know that.
yeah. And it also like fits into like that idea of like self-care and self-love, right? One, being authentically able to laugh, right? Like it's funny that you mentioned that of like, oh, we're stifling our laughter because we're supposed to be adults and those things aren't funny anymore, right? But like, you know, playfulness is a part of self-care, like humor is a part of self-care. And also, if I'm being my authentic self and laughing at a poo-poo joke, then who's to tell me that's wrong, right?
So if I'm trying to make a major change in my life and I feel like I'm a terrible person for having this problem to begin with, for making the choices I made to begin with, and I'm feeling ashamed of myself and I don't want to admit that, then maybe it's easier not even to address the fact that a change needs to happen. Right? So I want to quit drinking, but I don't want to admit that I'm an alcoholic because I have shame around the idea. So I just ignore the problem and I don't make the change. So guilt, I mean, shame, like whenever shame comes up, I want to like shine a spotlight on it as fast as possible so we can get it out of there, because there is no place for shame around here, right? Like we're all imperfect humans. We all make mistakes. We don't need to be ashamed about it, right? Guilt, on the other hand, is something that can occasionally be useful because as social animals, we need to be able to recognize when we overstep someone else's boundaries. And if we feel that prick of guilt, that is a really good clue to ourselves before anyone else ever points it out. It's a clue to ourselves that, oh yeah, I did make this mistake. I made this social faux pas. I should probably fix my mistake, talk to the person, not do it again. So that can be useful. But when it comes to making like a major change, it may be that there's some misplaced guilt, right? I feel guilty about having made this mistake so many times. So I'm just going to pretend it's not really a mistake and just keep moving forward and not make the change.
Hearing pressure from somebody else or having an internal pressure to be or do something a particular way for some reason, right? Like,
oh, right. And if it doesn't really fit you, if it's not really a change that makes sense for you, just experiencing the pressure to make the change isn't going to do you any good.
right. Yeah. Because then that can lead to more guilt and then more shame. Can we see how this could turn into a cycle of something that can be harder to deal with than, helpful? Which also makes me like think of something that we had talked about previously of like the idea of self-love, self-care. And I had this like epiphany of these two buzzwords, right? Of like, we've all heard self-love, we've all heard about self-care, and now we know that self-love is this deeper level of unconditionally like loving our authentic self, and self-care is the tools to help with that. And I'm like, wow, a lot of times self-care is used as something to avoid getting to that self-love piece, right? Like, okay, I know that I have something that I could be working on, right? On a deeper level. But if I just, journal for 15 minutes, or I go on a walk at the end of my day, maybe that'll make me feel better. And yes, I am not saying that those things cannot alleviate anxiety or uncomfortable feelings. They can, but at the end of the day, what I'll hear is, you know what, after I do those things, I feel relief, but then it all comes rushing back.
So you're saying self-care activities can be used to mask a deeper problem of not loving ourselves.
Yep.
Right. Right. So I'm imagining like what I really need to do to practice self-love is to have this deep and honest conversation with my partner about whatever, my boundaries, you fill in the blank. And since I'm afraid to admit that I'm vulnerable and don't want to be hurt, I'm going to book a massage, get my nails done, and just have a nice little day of pampering myself, which is not bad. Pamper yourself, please.
Yes.
But just don't use it to avoid the deeper problem.
Yeah. I feel like I kind of experienced a little bit of this myself, right? Of I need balance in my life, right? Feeling the pressures of work and my personal life. And if I just journal about it, it'll go away, right? Like that feeling of like, slowly moving towards burnout, like that's totally normal, right? Like everything is fine, guys. It's all gonna be fine. But honestly, like that it was a tactic of avoidance on my part of actually taking the step to tell other people that that's how I felt, and then also make steps in my life that is promoting that balance and keeping myself accountable to that balance, right? So actually making a schedule, holding the boundaries of that schedule, right? Like scheduling time of like breaks in the day. Who does breaks? It's crazy. Anyway, so like, but like things like that where yes, journaling is still something that I do. Reading.
Well, okay, but I want you to give yourself some credit here, right? Because journaling is the tool that you used to care for yourself in that moment when you needed it. And it helped you come to the understanding that you were closer to burnout than you realized. And if you were going to truly truly practice self-love, give yourself the gratitude, the acceptance, and the compassion that you needed to cultivate the self-love, you're going to have to take a bigger step. You're going to have to put some boundaries around your schedule, talk to your supervisor, so on and so forth. But you got there because you used that tool from your self-care kit.
Yeah.
Well done.
That is so true. And like, I could probably look in my journal and I could see that thought, right? Like of, oh man, I should probably do something about this. So you're right. No, that makes sense. And see, like that, it shows again those steps of the self-care can be an avoidance, but like you were saying, it also could be shedding a light on something that needs more, attention, and to get to that level of self-love.
So that's all the time that we have for today, but we'll be doing this every week. So tune back in, learn more about how to practice self-love, how to love yourself unconditionally.